Hi, I'm Andrew Torgett with Texas History for Teachers. The Civil War was the bloodiest war in all of American history, killing more than 750,000 people. It was also one of the most important wars because it ended slavery in the United States and in the process freed more than 4 million men, women, and children. Now, Texas was at the center of that story because it was a slaveholding state that joined the Confederacy. But here's the thing, not much fighting happened in Texas. The Union Army never launched a full-scale invasion of the state, and there were no major battles here. So most people today assume that Texas really didn't matter during the Civil War. But that's just wrong. Texas, as it turns out, played a powerful role in supporting the Confederacy. They went far beyond just sending soldiers to the front lines. So the key question is, what happened in Texas during the Civil War, and why did it matter so much? Now, Texas first supported the Confederacy by sending not only soldiers, but also supplies to the Confederate armies. And as the war went on, that became critical because supplies soon became really hard for Confederates to get. You see, Union armies marched everywhere in the South during the Civil War, from Virginia all the way down to Louisiana. And wherever those armies went, there were massive battles that destroyed people and property, and marching soldiers who sometimes burned farms and villages. And that created a lot of chaos, as you can imagine, which made it really difficult, sometimes impossible, for Southern farmers to grow the cotton that they needed for clothing or the corn that they needed to feed themselves and Confederate soldiers. But Texas was different than the rest of the South because the Union Army never mounted a full-scale invasion of the state, which meant that Texans were able to continue growing both cotton and corn, which they then used to help feed and clothe the rest of the Confederacy. Texas, in fact, was the only state that could also get supplies from the rest of the world. At the start of the war, the United States Navy set up a blockade of pretty much every key port along the entire Confederate coastline, all the way from Northern Virginia down to Galveston, Texas. And the intent was to isolate the South by cutting them off from trading with other countries or buying supplies on the international market. So in other words, the United States hoped to starve out the Confederacy. But Texas shared its southern border with Mexico, which made it possible for Confederates to get around the blockade. You see, the United States could not also block Mexican ports without starting a second war, so Confederates began sneaking cotton across the Texas-Mexico border, where it was then loaded onto boats, waiting on the other side, and shipped off to markets. And over the course of the Civil War, Texas shipped out more than 400,000 bales of cotton, worth $72 million, which would be around $1.7 billion today. And that, as you can imagine, brought a lot of supplies in for the Confederacy. Now, white Confederates also used Texas as a place to hide their slaves. Everywhere that Union armies marched in the Confederacy, enslaved people seized the opportunity to run away and claim their freedom for themselves and their families. And that took tremendous bravery amongst African Americans. And it scared their white owners, who were afraid to lose control of enslaved people and to lose the money that they had invested in them. But once again, Texas was different, precisely because it was one of the few southern places that the Union armies did not invade. And so as the war continued, many southern planters took their slaves to Texas in order to hide them from the Union armies and make sure that they didn't run away. In fact, more than 50,000 enslaved men, women, and children were brought to Texas during the war by slaveholders, which meant that by the end of the war, the African American population of Texas had swelled to 230,000 people. And so we are left with so many questions. Could the Confederacy have survived for 4 bloody years without Texans? What would have happened if the Union Army had invaded? One thing we do know is that Texas ultimately became the symbol for the biggest change the Civil War made possible. On June 19, 1865, a Union general named Gordon Granger arrived at Galveston as the Union Army finally came to Texas after the surrender of the Confederacy. And one of the very first things he did was to announce the end of slavery in Texas, declaring free the 230,000 people who had been enslaved in the state, which we now celebrate today as Juneteenth, which commemorates the end of slavery in Texas and the entire United States.